we're going to start the second chapter of Sukkah. And we're still engaged in the construction of the Sukkah itself. But as we move from the first to the second chapter, we are more engaged with how people behave in the Sukkah and how that relates to the architecture, which we're going to find. And the Mishnah is going to come back is going to begin with a bed. We've been talking about beds and bed planks for a while, and four-poster beds, which are covered with a canopy. Remember that a four-poster bed with a canopy above it is not okay for a sukkah, because the canopy above that four-poster is going to invalidate the sukkah for anybody sleeping in the bed. And it's the same if someone is sleeping underneath the bed. Hayashen tachat hamita b'sukkah lo yatsa yadei chovato. Someone who sleeps underneath the bed in the sukkah has not fulfilled their obligation. And we can imagine, just as the bedboards in place of schach are questionable, certainly someone sleeping underneath the bedboards, underneath the bed, is going to be questionable, because the bedboards are going to get in the way between the person who is sleeping and the schach at the top of the sukkah, which is the essential part of the sukkah. And Rabbi Yehuda is going to disagree. Amar Rabbi Yehuda nohagim hayinu shanim tachat hamita bifnei azkinim velo amru lanu davar. Rabbi Yehuda says, we used to sleep under a bed in the presence of the elders. Interesting, by the way. You get more of a sense, by the way, about living in public space. So everybody knew what everyone else's sukkah looked like and how they were behaving. And of course, sleeping was a much bigger deal. It was just as much a bigger deal as eating then. In the time of the Mishnah, you lived in your sukkah, you slept in it. Now, certainly in London, where it's really cold, people don't sleep in the sukkah very much. But in the time of the Mishnah, sleeping in the sukkah, that's the big thing. So Rabbi Yehuda says, look, they used to sleep in the sukkah in the presence of the elders, and the elders were fine with it. But remember, Rabbi Yehuda is the person who says that a sukkah can effectively be a permanent residence. Rabbi Yehuda is the one that says that a sukkah can be higher than 20 amot. He's the one that says that we can build it out of planks. So Rabbi Yehuda seems to have this view about permanence in the sukkah, which is essentially rejected by the other sages. And the halacha does not go according to Rabbi Yehuda. The halacha does not go according to Rabbi Yehuda, but we still appreciate his opinion and we preserve his opinion. And it's fascinating that the Mishnah chooses to preserve the minority opinions, even though it's absolutely established that we don't follow them. And Rabbi Shimon is now going to cut in. Amar Rabbi Shimon, Ma'aseh v'Tavi avdosh Rabban Gamliel. So we're going to have a story about Tavi, the slave of Rabban Gamliel. And we're going to learn something about the halacha of sleeping under a bed from Tavi, who was a slave, by the way, but also a Talmid Chacham. So Tavi's a Talmid Chacham. Shehaya Shen Tachat Hamita. Tavi used to sleep under the bed in the sukkah. Ve'amar lahen Rabban Gamliel as a kenim. Ritem Tavi Abdi. Shehu Talmid Chacham ve'odea she'avadim p'turim min hasukkah lefichach yashenhu tachat hamita. Rabban Gamliel used to say to the elders, look, have you seen Tavi, my slave? He's a Talmid Chacham. He knows that slaves are exempt from the mitzvah of sukkah. So he sleeps under the bed. He sleeps under the bed because he knows he's exempt. Ulfi darkenu, and in the same way, we learn shehayashen tachat hamita lo yatsa yadei chovato. And so from this incident, we learn from Rabban Gamliel that someone who sleeps under the bed hasn't fulfilled his obligation. And we haven't looked at Mishnah Brachot in this cycle, but Tavi is someone who's very important to Rabban Gamliel. And when Tavi died, this is a Mishnah in Brachot now, when Tavi died, Kibel alav tanchunim, Rabban Gamliel accepted condolences for him. It sounds like Rabban Gamliel sat shiva for Tavi, his slave. And his disciples protested. They said, look, haven't you taught us You don't accept condolences for slaves. Amar Lahim, he said to them, Ein Tavi Avdi Kishar Kol Avadim. My slave Tavi wasn't like other slaves. Kasher Haya. He was kasher. He's a Talmid Chacham and he's kasher. What about other situations to do with beds? I mean, interesting, the Mishnah is very, very interested in beds and sukkot. Hasomer sukkato b'kar'ei hamita. What if we support our sukkah with bedposts? So we take these bedposts and we use them to hold up the schach in the sukkah. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, im eino yechola la'amod b'fnei atzma psula. If the sukkah can't stand on its own, it's invalid. But then remember, Rabbi Yehuda thinks that a sukkah is a permanent object. And we're not going to follow Rabbi Yehuda. No, we're not going to follow him. Sukkah hamuduv lelet. Muduv lelet might be also like muvul belet. It's a mixed up sukkah. It's a disorderly sukkah. We don't really understand what this is. One commentator suggests that this is where the schach is kind of laid out in different angles. So there's some going north-south and some going east-west. The schach has all been thrown on the top of the sukkah in some random fashion. And another commentator, I think the Rambam, suggests that this is where the schach is sort of piling up on the sukkah. So it's in clumps. So it's sticking up and sticking down. There's something disarranged about this sukkah, but it's kshera, it's valid. And similarly, ve'shetzilata meruba mechavata kshera. If the shade is more than the sun, it's kashera, it's kasher. You can have as much shade as you like actually in a sukkah. And the Mishnah makes this clear. Hamuba can mean bite. If it's thick like a house, you've got so much schach. You've piled the schach on the top of your sukkah so much that it feels almost like a house. Even though the stars cannot be seen through it, kishera, it's a kosher sukkah. You can't invalidate a sukkah by putting too much schach on. You can invalidate it, by the way, by taking too much schach away. It has to have more shade. It has to have more shade than light. But if it can't have too much light, in other words. But if it's got too much shade, that seems to be not a problem. Although I do know some people who make sure they have a little gap in the schach of their sukkah every year just to make sure they can see at least one star. What if you built your sukkah, rather than building it out of bedposts, what if you built it on a moving object? And I thought you would be interested to see here a photograph of the sukkah taken in the Yom Kippur War. These troops, they all went off to war, right, on Yom Kippur 1973. And of course, straight after, they got to celebrate Sukkot. And some of these are dati, so what are they going to do? Well, this is a real archive photo from a journalist who was photographing the Yom Kippur War. And these are soldiers in the war. And you can see that they've actually got 4 poles tied to the side of their Jeep, maybe they're bed poles, and they put their schach, they found some schach somewhere. They've just cut it from a tree, right? They're somewhere in the desert, and they put some schach on the 4 poles above their Jeep. So they made a sukkah out of a Jeep. And you can make him out of a car too. Look, here's somewhere that maybe this is in Washington, D.C. I don't know. Looks like it might be an American. Look, it might be an American car. I'm not sure. Might be a left-hand drive car. And someone has taken off the sunshade. He's opened up the roof and just shoved a pile of schach on the roof. And I have heard, by the way, about Dayanim going out to visit. Anyway, you could do this anywhere if you needed to travel and not for the purpose of a mitzvah and you wanted to eat in your sukkah, you could just carry some schach in the trunk of your car and make a little sukkah like this. And that is actually what the Mishnah says. Sukkato b'rosh ha'agala or b'rosh ha'sfina kshera. Someone who makes his sukkah on the top of a wagon or on the top of a ship, it's kasher. Ve'olin la b'Yom Tov, and you can actually even go into it on Yom Tov. There's no problem about a sukkah built on a ship or a wagon. Borasha ilan or al gabe gamal kshera. If you made your sukkah on top of a tree or on the back of a camel, I was looking for a picture of a sukkah on a camel, but I couldn't find one for you. But kshera, it's kasher. However, ein olin la b'Yom Tov. We're not going to ride the camel on Yom Tov. And the rabbis have made a gezerah that we don't climb a tree actually on Yom Tov, because the rabbis are anxious that we're going to break off a branch. We're actually going to prune this tree on Yom Tov, which clearly we're not going to do. So they have a gezerah that we're not going to go up into it on Yom Tov. But in theory, on Chol HaMoed, you could make your sukkah on top of a tree. The Mishnah then continues, Shtayim ba'elan ve'achat bidei adam, 2 in a tree and 1 in the hands of man, made by man, or Shtayim bidei adam ve'achat be'ilan, or 2 made by man and 1 in a tree. Kshera, apparently it's kasher. Ve'ein olin la b'Yom Tov, but we don't go up into it in Yom Tov. And we don't really understand what we're talking about here. Is the floor of the sukkah supported by the tree? Or maybe the schach is supported at 2 points by the tree and 1, maybe it's supported at 2 points by a tree and at 1 point by a man-made object. It's not quite clear actually what this Mishnah means, and the commentators are not clear. And it goes on, Shalosh b'dei adam v'achat b'ilan kshera ve'olin la b'Yom Tov. 3 connection points made by man and 1 in a tree. It's kasher ve'olin la b'Yom Tov, and you can go into it on Yom Tov. Somehow it seems that we're not afraid about using the tree. I think the issue probably is if 3 connection points are man-made. So we must be talking at this point in the Mishnah about suspending the schach from a tree. So we're suspending the schach maybe from 1 tree and from 3 poles. Kshera ve'olin la b'Yom Tov, and you can get into it on Yom Tov. I guess because we're not actually using the tree to support the schach. The schach can stand if it's secured in 3 places without the tree. And the Mishnah confirms, Zeh klal, kol shenital ha'ilan ve'yochol la'amod b'fnei atzmo. This is the general rule. If anything could stand on its own when the tree was removed, if we theoretically, not actually, if we theoretically could take the tree out and the sukkah would remain standing, kasher, kshera, ve'olin la b'Yom Tov, and we can go into it on Yom Tov.